Lee, there's been some debate over services provided through the National Disability Insurance Scheme and what constitutes reasonable and necessary, and if that should change. If you've heard anything about it at all, there's a fair chance you'd think it's entirely about whether or not people with a disability can use their benefits to visit sex workers. But it turns out there's actually a lot more to this, and it's got disabled people and service providers worried. River Knight is the Chief Executive of Queensland Disability Services Provider Australian Communities. River, what do sex workers have to do with any of this? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. It's a very good question. What's actually being looked at the moment is defining the act and helping to clarify that term reasonable and necessary. And we understand that Mr. Robert is using sex workers to polarise the voting public and help, I guess, make that decision a little bit easier. But we're not really looking at that sex worker argument because it's such a small population of people that might even need support around sexuality. Maybe even asked for that. It's an important part of the work that we do that's long overdue. But the real issue at the moment is what is reasonable and necessary under the Act. It's very vague and it's not clear. And service providers and people are a little bit worried that this is going to be used to stop access for some things that might actually be really important, or maybe make the process a little bit tricky if it's not done really well.
So, does the definition of reasonable and necessary need to change? Can you explain that terminology and how it fits in with the NDIS and the kind of services that people might be hoping to access?
I think the support within the sector and the voices that I'm hearing are very much that it does need to be clarified because at the moment it's very broad. So it's very hard to make decisions. And what happens when it's very broad is that it's inconsistent. So what some staff at NDIS might say, yes, that's something that we can fund, and other staff might give a completely different answer based on their interpretation. So it makes it difficult when we have a broad definition. So we very much support what NDIS are doing, or at least Mr. Robert, in trying to tighten that up because it's so broad. But what it relates to is what sort of disability services that a person might need funding for, also what equipment they may need some funded support to access, and I guess some of the therapies and the capacity building things that people may need. But figuring out what need means and what's reasonable is really important so that we don't blow our budgets because we can't fund everything all the time for everybody. And service providers are used to running on the smell of an oily rag, so we're not expecting them to fund everything. But at the moment, it's a bit of an argumentative sort of approach to try and work out, well, how can I best debate what I think I need?
All right. So, what are the risks of changing that definition then? What could potentially happen for some clients of the NDIS?
Well, I think if the definition isn't changed really, I guess, well, and it's maybe over tightened, it means that some things that might actually be really important to individual cases won't be funded, and that's the essence of what we're talking about. So people have individual experiences of disability, and we need to make sure there's a function in the Act that every individual situation can be considered on its individual need. And when we start having a blanket yes and no approach, that starts to ruin the whole individualized approach to funding, which is kind of the essence of something like NDIS in the first place.
So, what kind of things do you think people could lose access to, or what are they worried about? Can you give us some examples?
There's I guess such a huge range of possibilities in terms of services and equipment that people might access. But just for an example, I once had a person who came to me, trying to figure out how they could purchase a piece of equipment locally that would do the job. So, for example, Johnny might need a bike that is part of his therapy and a specialised piece of equipment. Might be able to buy that locally from a service provider, nice and cheap. But if we tighten the definition up too much, maybe the definition will say, well, it can only be equipment that is specialised for disability services and purchased through a disability service provider, and they might make that bike 10 times the price. So we need to be able to be flexible. But other things that come up are things like the therapies going, how much therapy do I need? Are we going to standardize and say, you know what, for your disability, my book tells me that you only need 6 sessions
Yep.
and you shouldn't need anything more than that. And I'm not able to look at your individual situation because the Act is now so strict, it doesn't allow me to really respond to your individual needs. And that's the worry that we have, is that we won't have that capacity to be flexible.
So, in terms of providers like yourself having access into this whole debate at the moment, where do you stand, and when will you have a definitive answer on if this is going to be changed or not?
Well, I think it's been coming for a very long time, and we're all aware that it does need to be updated, that definition, and a lot of us are very supportive of that. I guess I'm not sure exactly what is being proposed and just how that language is going to be tested in terms of legislation. I really hope that Mr. Robert makes sure that he does talk to service providers and participants about the ground level impact of certain wording that might be popped into that legislation, because that's where it's going to make the difference.
Oh, well, look, I hope you get clarity for your clients and others who are listening throughout Queensland this afternoon who might be worried about losing access to some of the services that they already have through the NDIS. River, thanks so much for joining us on the program this afternoon.